The rain had not stopped for 3 days, turning the once proud courtyard of the occupied city into a patchwork of mud and stagnant puddles. Soldiers moved like shadows in the drizzle, their boots sucking at the ground as though the earth itself resented their presence. Beneath the gray canopy of clouds, a stage had been erected, rough wooden planks lashed together in haste, but solid enough to hold the attention of the hundreds of people now crammed into the square. The crowd was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that trembles with fear rather than reverence. They knew what was coming, and still they had come, because in times like these, no one dared stay away when the conquerors demanded an audience. To resist was to vanish. To watch was to survive. At the center of the platform, shackled between two guards, stood Elena Markov. She was no soldier, no spy, and yet her name had traveled through whispers in alleyways and basements for months. Some said she had smuggled messages for the resistance. Others swore she was nothing more than a schoolteacher who had refused to teach the conquerors propaganda. Whatever the truth, it no longer mattered. What mattered was the spectacle her punishment would make, the warning carved into human flesh for all to see. Her dark hair clung damply to her cheeks, her dress, once a modest blue, now hung heavy and soaked. Even with mud spattering the hem, she carried herself with a kind of quiet defiance, her eyes forward, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. She looked like someone who had already decided they would not beg. Behind the assembled officers, one man stood apart, his long coat shielding him from the worst of the weather. General Armand Kessler, commander of the Eastern Front, was not usually present for punishments of this kind. He had men to command, cities to burn, strategies to refine. Yet today he had come, his presence lending gravity to what might otherwise have been dismissed as another petty humiliation in a war already thick with them. He had been told Elena was dangerous, not because she carried weapons but because she carried ideas. She had rallied the young, whispered of freedom when silence was demanded. The kind of spirit, his advisers had warned, that spreads faster than fire if not extinguished swiftly and mercilessly. The officer in charge of the proceedings stepped forward, barking orders in a clipped voice. For crimes against the authority of the new order, for spreading lies and inciting rebellion, this woman shall be made an example. Let all who watch remember, resistance will be stripped bare, its shame laid open, its pride broken. His words carried over the damp crowd, bouncing off stone walls, and though no one spoke in reply, their shifting eyes told the truth. They were watching, they were remembering, and they were afraid. The guards moved closer to Elena, their hands rough, tugging at the ties of her soaked dress. A ripple went through the crowd, a collective intake of breath. The act was not about execution, nor even interrogation. It was humiliation turned into theater, the conqueror's favorite kind of dominance. Elena's chin lifted as the fabric was wrenched at her shoulders, exposing her to the cold air, to the eyes that would not or could not look away. For a moment, the drizzle seemed to pause as if the sky itself recoiled at the cruelty staged below it. Her pale skin glistened under the rain, and though her body trembled, she did not lower her gaze. From his place above the platform, General Kessler's jaw tightened. He had overseen bombings, had ordered executions, had watched men broken under interrogation, but something about this was different. It was not the violence that disturbed him. Violence was the currency of war, it was the spectacle. It was the way her defiance refused to be stripped away, even as her dignity was peeled from her piece by piece. He found himself staring longer than he should have, his hands tightening behind his back, the cold steel of his gloves biting into his skin. He told himself it was contempt, that he was measuring her weakness, cataloging her rebellion so that he could crush it completely. But in the pit of his stomach, a different truth coiled, one he did not want to name. The villagers shifted uneasily, caught between horror and the instinct for survival. Mothers clutched their children's heads to their chests, but even so the little ones peeked out with wide eyes, learning lessons about power that would never leave them. Old men clenched their fists until their knuckles whitened, knowing that to move, to protest, was to invite their own destruction. And still, Elena stood unyielding, her body vulnerable, her spirit intact. She was already more than flesh, she was a symbol now, and symbols were dangerous things. The rain thickened, drumming harder on the planks of the stage, sliding down Elena's exposed shoulders. One of the guards smirked, shoving her roughly so she staggered forward, and the crowd murmured, though no one dared to raise their voice. Kessler's eyes followed every motion, every shiver that racked her frame, every heartbeat of defiance that seemed to pulse in her stillness. He should have looked away. He should have turned his back as so many others did, reducing the scene to just another grim necessity of conquest. But he couldn't. Something about her presence held him fixed, as though she had reached into the core of him and refused to let go. And though the square reeked of fear, though the spectacle was meant to crush hope, a strange and dangerous thought began to take root within the general's mind, that perhaps this woman, even stripped and humiliated, was stronger than any army he commanded. The soldiers were laughing now, their voices sharp and ugly in the wet air, their amusement filling the silence the villagers dared not break. Elena did not flinch, even as the last remnants of fabric clung to her like shredded banners after a battle, her dignity in tatters but her gaze unbroken. She looked out over the crowd as though searching for something beyond their bowed heads, something beyond this square, beyond this day. And for a heartbeat, it seemed as though she had found it, not in their eyes which were lowered in shame and fear, but in the knowledge that she still stood, that they still saw her standing. That was enough to remind them all that defiance could survive even the most deliberate cruelty. General Kessler's breath came shallow, fogging faintly in the damp air. He wanted to believe he was studying her for signs of weakness, cataloging the ways humiliation could fracture resistance, but he could not lie to himself so easily anymore. He was not watching as a commander measures an enemy. He was watching as a man unwillingly drawn into a struggle he had never anticipated. He had expected her to weep, to plead, to shatter before the crowd so thoroughly that her defiance would collapse into silence. Yet she stood with her chin high, her shoulders straight, her body trembling only because the air was cold, not because her spirit was broken. It disturbed him, this kind of strength, because it made him feel the weight of all his own choices pressing down harder than the rain. The officer leading the punishment barked for the guards to bring the lash. A murmur swept through the crowd like a breath caught between ribs. Whispers of horror fluttered from mother to child, from neighbor to neighbor, because humiliation was one thing but pain was another. To see a woman stripped and paraded was to be reminded of their helplessness. To hear her cries would be to share them, to feel them echo in their own bones. Yet Elena gave them nothing, not yet. She stood firm, her wrists bound, her gaze unwavering, and in that moment she seemed less like a victim and more like a statue carved from stubborn stone. One of the guards stepped forward, the leather whip curled in his hand, droplets of rain sliding down its length. He sneered as though the entire moment belonged to him, as though he were the architect of this cruelty. He raised his arm high, savoring the pause, the anticipation of the strike. But before the lash could fall, a sharp voice rang out, cutting across the square like a blade. Enough. The word came from General Kessler, crisp and commanding, snapping through the air with all the authority of his rank. The officer on the platform froze mid-gesture, the guards stiffened, and the crowd rippled in confusion. Eyes turned toward the general, some filled with hope, others with dread. Kessler stepped forward, his boots squelching in the mud, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his cap. He mounted the steps of the platform slowly, each movement deliberate, as though he were measuring every inch of ground between himself and the woman who refused to bow. The officer cleared his throat nervously, glancing from Kessler to Elena and back again. General, with respect, the punishment must be carried out. Orders were given. I gave the orders, Kessler interrupted, his tone cutting. And I will decide when they have been fulfilled. His eyes flicked toward the guard holding the whip, and though he said nothing more, the man lowered his arm and stepped back instantly, his bravado evaporating under the weight of that gaze. Elena turned her head slowly toward Kessler, her eyes meeting his for the first time. There was no gratitude in her stare, no relief. Only a steady, quiet challenge, as if daring him to see her not as a symbol to be crushed, but as a human being he could not own. The silence between them was taut, a string stretched to breaking. The crowd watched in suspended breath, the rain beating against them, their fear momentarily pierced by confusion and curiosity. Kessler stood close enough now to see the fine tremor of her body from the cold, to see the rain coursing down her collarbone, to see the iron determination in her eyes. He could have turned then, could have declared the punishment concluded and left her to the guards. But something inside him, something he could not name, chained his feet to that platform. Against every instinct, against every lesson carved into him by years of war, he spoke again, his voice lower this time, meant for her more than anyone else. You are not broken, he said. Her lips parted just slightly, not in surprise but in the faintest curve of something between a smirk and a sneer. And you cannot break me. The words were soft, but they carried farther than he expected, reaching the ears of the crowd and stirring them like embers in a dying fire. People shifted, lifted their heads, some even daring to meet her gaze now, as though her defiance had given them permission to remember their own pride. The officer bristled, clearly unsettled by the direction the spectacle had taken, but he said nothing, unwilling to challenge his superior directly. Kessler lingered a moment longer, his eyes locked with Elena's, feeling the strange gravity between them tighten, heavier than the weight of the war, heavier than the expectations of his men. He should have ended it there, should have commanded her execution to erase the danger she posed. But instead, he turned abruptly and descended the platform steps, his coat sweeping behind him, his boots striking hard against the wood. "The punishment is concluded," he declared, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Shock rippled through the onlookers, disbelief written on their faces. Elena remained bound, still exposed but untouched, further, her defiance undiminished. The guards hesitated, uncertain whether to release her or await further command. Kessler did not look back, though every nerve in his body urged him to. He strode through the mud, the rain, the silence that now held the crowd in its grip. But even as he walked away, he knew the truth he could not admit aloud. He had not spared her for strategy nor for mercy. He had spared her because in the depth of her unbroken stare, he had seen something he could no longer deny. Something that would haunt him long after the rain stopped falling. The square dispersed slowly after the general's order, as though the crowd did not quite believe what they had witnessed. People shuffled away under the curtain of rain, heads still low but eyes flicking nervously back to the platform where Elena stood bound. The guards, unsure whether to release her without further command, kept her tethered like a prize no one dared claim. Their laughter had faded, replaced by unease, because the spectacle had not ended the way it was meant to. Punishments were supposed to break their subjects, to remind the people of their own powerlessness. But now whispers crawled like ivy through the gathered villagers. "She stood, she did not fall." The general himself stopped it. These words would grow in the dark corners of kitchens and cellars, and Kessler, for all his silence, knew it. He had not crushed rebellion today. He had fed it. Elena's chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of control. She would not allow them to see her weakness, not here, not while the eyes of her people clung to her form. Her body shivered under the cold, her skin slick with rain, but her spirit burned, hotter now that the whip had never landed. She had stared into the eyes of the conqueror and he had faltered. That alone was a victory, though she did not yet understand the cost. She watched his retreating back, the sharp lines of his shoulders beneath the coat, the tension in every step. He was a man at war with himself, she realized. And though she despised him, though she hated everything he represented, she knew that her survival now rested in the contradiction that had flickered in his gaze. The guards finally received an order from the officer in charge, who, embarrassed and resentful, waved them toward the barracks. "Take her inside," he muttered. "She'll be held until further notice." His voice carried none of the cruel bravado it had earlier. Humiliation had shifted from Elena to him, and though his uniform gave him authority, he knew he had been reduced in the eyes of both the people and his own men. As they dragged Elena from the platform, their grips rough but uncertain, the villagers caught one last glimpse of her raised head. That image, even more than her words, would remain with them long after she disappeared behind the iron gates of the garrison. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of damp stone and old wood. The barracks had been a school once, before the occupation. Now its classrooms served as holding cells, its blackboards smeared with chalk lines of orders instead of lessons. They shoved her into one of the rooms, shackles clanging as she stumbled onto the cold floor. The door slammed shut, iron bolts sliding with a finality that would have broken many. Elena sat slowly against the wall, her breath still calm, her mind racing. She knew the general had spared her for reasons that were not kindness, not mercy, but something more dangerous. She had become valuable to him, though she did not yet understand how or why. General Kessler returned to his quarters with the rain still dripping from his coat. He dismissed his aides with a flick of his hand and stood alone at the wide window, staring out at the square that was now nearly empty. He replayed the moment in his mind again and again, the guards tearing at her dress, the whip raised high, the defiance in her eyes. He had intervened without thought, driven by something beyond strategy. It was weakness, he told himself, an indulgence he could not afford. Yet even as he whispered the word, his jaw tightened against it. Weakness did not look like what he had seen on that platform. Weakness was surrender, submission, the crumbling of spirit. What he had seen was the opposite, a woman stripped bare who still refused to bow. He envied it even as he feared it. His officers would question him soon. They would whisper of his hesitation, of the leniency he had shown. Already the seeds of doubt would be sprouting among his men. They would wonder if their general had lost his resolve, if the iron fist of conquest had softened. It was a dangerous impression, more dangerous than any bullet or blade. and yet he could not regret it. The moment her words had struck him, "And you cannot break me," something inside him had shifted, something that had long been buried beneath layers of command and cruelty. He could not yet name it, but it pulled at him even now, demanding his attention as surely as the rain demanded the earth. In her cell, Elena leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. Exhaustion threatened to drag her into sleep, but she resisted. She had survived the square, but survival was not the same as freedom. She knew she had become a tool in their hands, her body, her spirit, a message to both the villagers and the soldiers. They would use her as long as she was useful, then discard her when she no longer served their purpose. But she also knew something else. She had seen hesitation in the eyes of the man who commanded them all. If there was a crack in the iron mask of the general, she would find it, and she would drive her defiance into it until it split apart. The night deepened, heavy and restless. Guards paced the corridors, their boots echoing like drumbeats of a funeral march. Somewhere, a drunk officer laughed too loudly, his voice bleeding through the thin walls. And above it all, in his private chamber, General Kessler poured himself a glass of brandy he did not drink. He stood alone, staring at his reflection in the dark window, and for the first time in years, he wondered not about strategies or sieges, but about a single woman who refused to fall when all others would have collapsed. Morning came not with sunlight but with a dull, heavy gray that pressed against the city like a shroud. The rain had stopped, leaving behind streets slick with mud and the stench of soaked wood and smoke. Inside the garrison, the atmosphere was no less heavy. Soldiers moved stiffly through their routines, eyes cast downward, voices subdued. Something had shifted the day before, something none of them dared to name outright but all of them had felt. The general had broken the rhythm of fear. The punishment had not concluded as it should have, and now uncertainty clung to every corridor like mildew. Men who had laughed at Elena's humiliation now avoided speaking of it at all. To mention it was to admit that something had gone wrong. Elena sat in her cell, the chains cold against her wrists, her thin frame hunched against the stone wall. She had not slept much, but her mind was clearer in the morning. She thought of her people, the villagers who had seen her endure without yielding. She thought of the way their eyes had flickered with something dangerous, hope. Hope was as much a weapon as any gun, and though she was trapped within walls, she had already given it to them. She clung to that thought, because it meant her suffering had not been in vain. Still, she could not ignore the other truth pressing in on her. She was still alive only because of him. The general. His intervention was not mercy, it was something more complicated, something she could not yet untangle. In the general's quarters, the silence did not last long. By midday, 3 of his senior officers stood before him, their uniforms immaculate, their expressions tense with barely concealed disapproval. Colonel Drexler, a man whose loyalty had always leaned more toward the iron rule of fear than to strategy, stepped forward first. "General Kessler," he began, his voice clipped and cold, "yesterday's interruption has caused confusion among the men, among the civilians. The punishment was meant to be a demonstration. Instead, it has raised questions." Kessler leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled before his face. His eyes did not waver from the colonel's. "Questions are not dangerous, Colonel. Answers are." The second officer, Major Havel, shifted uneasily, his tone softer but still pointed. "With respect, General, we cannot afford weakness. These people live on the edge of defiance already. If they sense hesitation from us, they will take advantage of it. Yesterday, it looked like hesitation." Kessler's jaw tightened. He had anticipated this. He knew his decision had sent ripples he could not easily control. Still, he would not allow his authority to be challenged in front of him. He lowered his hands, placing them flat against the desk with deliberate calm. "I saw a spectacle on that platform that served no purpose but to feed the cruelty of lesser men. Do not mistake discipline for savagery. We conquer with order, not with theater." The third officer, Captain Reinhardt, younger than the others, spoke hesitantly, his eyes betraying a flicker of doubt not in Kessler but in himself. "Sir, what will become of the prisoner now? If she is allowed to live, she becomes a symbol. If she is executed, she becomes a martyr. The men are waiting for your word." Kessler rose from his chair slowly, the leather creaking under him. He walked to the window, looking out over the city, its rooftops still glistening from the rain. His reflection stared back at him faintly, the lines of his face sharper, more hollow than he remembered. "She remains alive," he said finally. "Her fate will be decided when it serves us, not before. Until then, she stays in our custody." The officers exchanged glances, none bold enough to argue further, but none content either. They saluted stiffly and departed, leaving Kessler alone once more. Yet their unease lingered like smoke in the room, and he knew it would spread among the ranks. He had bought time with his authority, but time was a fragile currency in war. In her cell, Elena heard the footsteps of soldiers outside, the scrape of boots, the shifting weight of rifles. She had learned long ago to read their movements like words. There was hesitation in their rhythm now, uncertainty in their silence. They no longer swaggered past her door. They lingered, as though listening for something, as though expecting her to speak. She almost laughed at the irony. Imprisoned, half-starved, stripped of everything, and yet she had unsettled them more than they had unsettled her. When the door finally creaked open, it was not the guards but a young soldier, barely more than a boy, who slipped inside. His uniform hung too loosely on his thin frame, his eyes darting nervously as though he were trespassing in enemy territory. He set down a tin of water and a scrap of bread on the floor, his hands trembling. "Eat," he muttered, not meeting her gaze. "Quickly." Elena studied him silently before speaking. "Why?" His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. "Because," his voice faltered, then steadied with effort. "Because you stood yesterday when none of us could. Because he couldn't look away." He glanced toward the corridor, fear tightening his movements, then fled before she could respond. The door shut again, leaving Elena with more questions than answers. She picked up the bread, her hands shaking not from hunger but from the weight of what the boy had said. Because he couldn't look away. She thought of the general's eyes, locked on hers in the rain. There had been no mercy there, but there had been something dangerous, something human. And if she could find a way to use it, to turn his conflict against him, then perhaps she could do more than survive. Perhaps she could strike at the very heart of the empire that had sought to strip her bare. The following evening, when the lamps in the garrison flickered against the damp stone walls, Elena was roused by the sound of keys scraping against the lock. She pushed herself upright, expecting guards with another meal or perhaps another attempt to remind her of her captivity. But when the door opened, it was not the boy from before, nor the smirking soldiers who had bound her in the square. It was him. General Kessler stepped into the cell with a presence that seemed to shrink the walls around them. The door shut behind him with a metallic thud, and for the first time since her capture, Elena found herself truly alone with the man who had both condemned and spared her. He stood for a long moment without speaking, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, his eyes studying her as though she were both a threat and a puzzle. The faint lantern light cut sharp lines across his face, revealing the hardness of a man shaped by war, but also the shadows under his eyes that no authority could hide. Elena refused to look away, though her stomach churned with a mix of unease and defiance. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. "You should be dead," Kessler said finally, his voice low, resonant, carrying not cruelty but something colder, certainty. "Any other in your position would have been executed at once. The officers demand it. The people expect it." He took a slow step forward, his boots echoing against the stone floor. "And yet here you remain. Do you know why?" Elena lifted her chin, the chains rattling softly as she shifted her weight. "Because you couldn't stomach it," she said evenly. "Because for all your speeches of conquest, for all your cruelty, you saw something you couldn't destroy. And it frightened you." For the first time, his expression flickered, not with anger but with something unreadable. He moved closer, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of leather and rain still clinging to his coat. "You think you frighten me?" His tone carried no mockery, only curiosity, as though he genuinely wanted to know her answer. "You should," she replied. Her voice was steady, each word deliberate. "Because no matter what you do to me, no matter how many times you strip me or parade me or lock me in this cage, you will never own me. And the more your people see that, the more they will realize they cannot be owned either." Silence stretched between them, heavy and sharp. Kessler's gaze remained fixed on her, but something in his posture shifted, the rigid lines of command loosening for the briefest of moments. He exhaled slowly, his gloved hand brushing across the edge of the lantern, casting shadows that danced across the walls. "You mistake defiance for power," he said finally. "Defiance dies in chains. Power endures." "And yet here I am," Elena answered. "Defiant. Alive. While you are the one explaining yourself to me." The word struck deeper than she realized. Kessler turned away suddenly, pacing the small confines of the cell like a caged animal himself. His boots rang against the stone, his movements sharp, restless. He had faced enemy generals across battlefields, had seen cities crumble into ash, but never had he felt so unsteady as he did now, confronted not with armies or artillery but with a single unbroken will. He stopped at the far wall, his back to her, and for a moment she thought he might leave without another word. Instead, he spoke quietly, almost as if to himself. I should end this now. If I let you live, you become a symbol. If I kill you, you become a martyr. Either way, you spread like fire through dry fields. He turned back to her, his eyes dark with something she could not name. Tell me, Elena Markov, what am I to do with you? Elena held his stare, refusing to shrink under the weight of his presence. That is your problem, General. Not mine. You brought me here. You spared me. And now you cannot undo it. Whatever you choose, you lose. A faint smile ghosted across his lips, though it held no humor. You speak like someone who has already won. Perhaps I have, she said softly, though her body still trembled from exhaustion. Because I stood in front of your army, in front of your people, and you could not look away. That will haunt you far longer than these chains will haunt me. His jaw tightened, his gloved fingers flexing as though resisting an impulse he did not dare name. The silence between them grew charged, the air thick with something that was not quite hatred, not quite respect, not quite desire, but some dangerous mixture of all three. Kessler stepped closer again, close enough that she could feel the faint heat radiating from him despite the damp chill of the cell. His eyes lingered on hers as though searching for something he could not destroy, something he could not take. Then, with abrupt finality, he turned toward the door. He rapped his knuckles once against the metal, and the bolt slid open from outside. Before stepping through, he paused, his voice low, almost reluctant. You think I cannot break you? Perhaps you're right. But understand this, I will not look away again. The door slammed shut, leaving Elena alone once more. Her heart raced, though she forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly. She had stood her ground, but she knew now more than ever that she was playing a dangerous game. The general was no ordinary tyrant. He was a man at war with himself, and men like that were unpredictable. She leaned her head back against the cold stone, whispering into the silence, "Then keep watching, General. Because I will never fall." The days that followed were marked by a tense, unspoken shift in the atmosphere of the garrison. Soldiers who once barked orders or sneered when they passed Elena's cell now lingered outside in silence, their eyes averted, their steps slower. Some pretended indifference, but their hesitation betrayed them. They had seen what had happened in the square, they had seen the general falter, and though no one dared speak it aloud, the knowledge crept among them like smoke through cracks in a wall. A woman had stood unbroken in the face of power, and the most powerful man among them had been unable to destroy her. It was a thought that changed the way they looked at her, and perhaps the way they looked at themselves. Elena felt it. She could not see the city beyond the stone walls, but she could sense the ripples spreading outward. Every time a guard shifted nervously, every time a young soldier slipped an extra scrap of bread into her rations, she knew her defiance was working its way into their veins. Hope was contagious, and once it took root, it was harder to kill than any person. She nursed it carefully, not with grand speeches but with the simple act of enduring, of meeting every stare with unyielding eyes. Even bound, even trapped, she remained untouchable in a way they could not explain. General Kessler, meanwhile, found himself more restless than he had been in years. He spent long hours at his desk, reports spread before him, maps inked with lines of control and rebellion. Yet the lines blurred, the words grew hollow, because no matter how many times he tried to bury himself in strategy, his mind returned to her. Elena. The woman who should have been broken, who should have been reduced to silence, but who instead had forced him to confront his own hesitation. He told himself it was weakness, and yet when he replayed her words, "Whatever you choose you lose," he could not escape the sense that she had struck at something deeper. At night he walked the corridors alone, the echo of his boots against the stone louder than usual, as though the building itself questioned him. Once, pausing outside her cell, he listened in silence. He expected sobs, the broken mutterings of despair. Instead, he heard a soft hum, a fragment of a song, perhaps one she had taught to her students before the war. The sound was faint, almost fragile, but it carried through the heavy silence with a defiance sharper than any blade. He found his hand resting against the cold metal of the door, as though tempted to open it, to step inside again. But he did not. He turned away, each step heavier than the last. The tension came to a head 3 nights later during a meeting with his officers. Colonel Drexler was the first to speak, his voice cutting through the stale air like a blade. "General, this cannot continue. She is becoming a myth among the civilians. Already they whisper her name as though she were a saint. If we do not act, she will undo everything we've built here." Kessler's expression remained unreadable, but his voice carried a quiet warning. And what do you suggest, Colonel? That we parade her again? Lash her until her body breaks? You saw what happened last time. It will not silence them, it will ignite them. Major Havel leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. Then execute her. Quietly if you prefer. A bullet to the head, a shallow grave. No spectacle, no martyrdom. Just silence. Silence stretched after the words, thick and suffocating. Kessler's jaw tightened, but he did not immediately respond. He knew the logic was sound, the solution simple. And yet, as he considered it, the image of Elena's steady gaze returned unbidden, and with it, the strange unease that had taken root in him since that day in the square. To kill her would be efficient. But it would also be an admission that she had unsettled him enough to warrant it. Finally he spoke, his voice like iron. No. She remains alive. The officers bristled, exchanging uneasy glances. Drexler's lips curled into a thin sneer. Alive, she undermines you. The men speak of her already. The people cling to her as though she were proof that you can be defied. Every day she breathes, General, your grip weakens. Kessler's eyes snapped to him, cold and sharp enough to still the air. Every day she breathes, Colonel, she reminds them that their hope is contained within these walls. They come to us, not we to them. Let them whisper. Let them hope. It changes nothing. His words silenced the room, though not the doubt that lingered behind their eyes. When the meeting adjourned, the officers filed out stiffly, but Kessler knew the matter was not settled. His decision had sown cracks not only among the civilians but within his own command. In her cell, Elena sensed the shift as well. That night, another young soldier passed by her door, his voice low as he whispered, "They argue about you, you know. The officers. The general protects you." He hurried off before she could reply, but the words were enough. She leaned back against the wall, her lips curving into the faintest smile. She had become a fracture in their armor, a fault line in the iron wall of their rule. All she had to do now was wait, push when the moment was right, and the entire structure might collapse. But as she lay in the dark, her thoughts turned again to the general himself. He was not like the others, cruel, simple, predictable. He was something far more dangerous, conflicted. And conflicted men made choices that could shape nations. She wondered if he realized that in sparing her, in protecting her, he had already chosen. The city outside the fortress was no longer quiet. Whispers had turned to songs and songs had turned to shouts. Elena's name echoed in alleys and marketplaces, carried in low voices from door to door. Mothers taught their children to hum the tune she had once sung from her cell, a melody that became a secret anthem of defiance. Every patrol reported the same thing. The people were restless, watching with eyes that no longer looked down in fear but forward with something dangerous, expectation. The rebellion that had been fragmented and weak was stirring, as though the courage she displayed in the square had ignited a single spark that now spread like wildfire. Inside the garrison, the soldiers felt the shift just as much as the civilians. The lines of loyalty blurred. Some still clung to the chain of command, to the authority of the general and the threat of punishment. But others hesitated. Some carried themselves with guilt, unable to forget the image of Elena stripped and humiliated, yet unbroken. A few had begun to secretly pass notes or food to sympathizers in the city. Even the most disciplined forces cannot hold forever when belief itself begins to erode. General Kessler watched it all unfold with growing unease. He had fought rebellions before, crushed uprisings with brutal efficiency, but this was different. This was not an armed force to scatter with bullets or a political rival to silence with a knife in the dark. This was something far more insidious, faith. A woman, unarmed and bound, had defied him in front of thousands, and instead of breaking, she had planted herself in their hearts. Every day she remained alive, she became larger in their imagination, a living symbol stronger than any speech or weapon. And yet he could not bring himself to kill her. The thought came to him late at night, gnawing like hunger. A single bullet could end it, could strip the rebellion of its figurehead. He had executed countless before her, never with hesitation, never with this hollow weight pressing against his chest. But when he closed his eyes, he saw her gaze, not pleading, not broken, but steady, condemning, as if daring him to choose. That gaze haunted him more than the thought of rebellion itself. The officers, however, grew louder in their demands. Colonel Drexler cornered him again, his voice sharp with frustration. "General, with every passing day we lose control. If you will not act, then I will. Give the order or step aside." Kessler's response was ice. "You will not touch her." Drexler's face darkened, but he did not press further. Not openly. Yet Kessler knew the man was dangerous, his ambition simmering beneath the surface. If Drexler sensed weakness in his commander, he would act on his own. That thought gnawed at Kessler, pushing him closer to a precipice he did not want to name. Meanwhile, Elena herself remained calm within the storm. She heard the distant murmurs of unrest through the stone walls, caught fragments of defiance from the guards who faltered when they looked at her. She understood that the rebellion outside was not hers alone, it was theirs. She had merely given them the proof they needed, the vision that fear could be resisted. And yet she also knew that her survival was precarious. The general's protection could not last forever. One slip, one shift in the balance of power, and her life would end. But if that end came, she was certain it would not be meaningless. The breaking point arrived one evening when a riot flared at the edge of the city. Civilians clashed with soldiers, stones against rifles, and though the skirmish was brief, it left the streets scarred and the air heavy with tension. When news reached the fortress, Drexler slammed his fist on the table. Enough. This is because she lives. Execute her now, and we cut the head off this serpent before it coils tighter. All eyes turned to Kessler. He stood at the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable. The silence stretched until it was nearly unbearable. Finally he spoke, "If we kill her now, she will become a martyr. If we keep her, she is still ours to control. The rebellion wants her free, not dead. That is her power, and that is our leverage." The officers muttered, some in reluctant agreement, others in open doubt. But none could defy his command, not yet. Later that night, Kessler found himself once again outside Elena's cell. For a long moment, he stood in silence, torn between duty and something he did not dare to name. At last he unlocked the door and stepped inside. She sat against the wall, her wrists raw from the rope, but her posture straight, her gaze steady. "You hear them, don't you?" he asked quietly, his voice stripped of the authority it usually carried. "I hear freedom," she replied. He studied her for a long moment, the flicker of torchlight painting shadows across his face. "You've turned my soldiers into doubters. You've turned the people into rebels. Tell me, Elena, was that your plan all along?" Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "I had no plan, General. Only the truth. It spreads on its own." The words stung him more than he cared to admit. He wanted to argue, to reassert control, but something in her voice, in her unshaken calm, hollowed him. For the first time in years he felt as though the ground beneath his feet was shifting. As he left the cell, one thought pressed against his mind with unbearable weight. The rebellion was no longer outside his walls. It was inside him. The night after the riot, the city did not sleep. Fires burned in scattered districts where civilians had driven out patrols, and chants echoed in the dark, swelling louder than the soldiers' attempts to silence them. Elena's name rose again and again, woven into a rhythm that made the walls of the fortress seem to tremble. For General Kessler, every echo was a hammer strike against his authority, each voice another stone chipping away at the order he had built his career defending. In the officers' chamber, the air was thick with argument. Drexler stood, furious, his voice cutting through the noise. "She is poison, and you are letting her rot this army from the inside. If you will not execute her, then I will take command myself." He slammed his fist on the table, the threat no longer veiled. Around him, several officers nodded, muttering their support. Kessler's eyes narrowed. His hand hovered near the hilt of his sword, though he did not draw it. "You mistake discipline for weakness, Colonel. Do not force me to remind you where your loyalty lies." But Drexler's defiance was no longer isolated. The rebellion outside had infected the fortress itself, and the officers' silence told Kessler that the ground beneath him was crumbling. He dismissed them with a clipped order, but as they filed out, he could feel Drexler's ambition sharpening like a blade behind his back. That night, Kessler walked the corridors alone, the weight of indecision dragging at every step. He had never wavered in command before, never questioned, never doubted. And yet, Elena's voice lingered in his ears, her quiet certainty echoing louder than the chaos outside. When he reached her cell, he stopped, his hand pressed to the cold iron bars. Inside, she was awake, sitting cross-legged, her face calm despite the storm raging beyond the walls. "They will turn on you soon," she said softly, as if she had read his thoughts. Kessler exhaled slowly. "They already are. You know what must be done." Her words cut him. She didn't plead for her life, didn't ask for release. She spoke with the conviction of someone who had already accepted her fate, and in that acceptance she wielded a power stronger than any sword. Kessler unlocked the door and stepped inside. "Do you think they will follow you?" he asked. Elena met his gaze without hesitation. "Not me. The idea of freedom. I am only the reminder they needed. You could silence me, General, but you cannot silence what they've already seen. Kessler looked at her for a long moment, his jaw tight, his heart pounding in a rhythm he didn't want to admit was fear. For the first time in his life he was staring at an enemy he could not conquer because the battlefield was not land or walls, it was belief. The decision he made then was not one of strategy but of surrender to something deeper. He cut the ropes at her wrists. The bindings fell to the floor with a soft thud, louder in his mind than any explosion. "Go," he whispered, "before I change my mind." But fate would not grant him the quiet of secrecy. Even as Elena stood, the door at the far end of the corridor burst open, and Drexler stormed in with armed soldiers. His eyes went wide as he saw the general with the prisoner freed, and a grin of triumph twisted his face. "I knew it," Drexler spat. "You've gone soft. You've betrayed the command you swore to protect." The soldiers hesitated, their rifles raised but their eyes uncertain. Some looked at Elena, others at Kessler, caught between the man who had led them for years and the woman whose courage had already shaken their world. Kessler drew his sword, not toward Elena but toward Drexler. "Stand down, Colonel." But Drexler only sneered. "No. This ends tonight." He raised his pistol. The shot rang out, deafening in the stone corridor. But it was not Elena who fell. Kessler's blade had struck first, driving through Drexler's chest before the bullet found its mark. Drexler crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide with disbelief, his blood spreading dark across the floor. The silence that followed was suffocating. The soldiers stood frozen, staring at the body of their colonel, then at the general, then at the woman who should have been a prisoner. Slowly, one by one, they lowered their weapons. Kessler, breathing hard, turned to Elena. His uniform was stained with blood, not hers, but his hands were no less guilty for it. "Go," he said again, his voice raw. "Lead them. I can hold this place no longer." Elena studied him, her expression unreadable. "You could come with us." For a long moment, Kessler said nothing. The man who had ruled with iron, who had believed in order above all else, stood at the edge of a choice that would erase everything he had been. At last he shook his head. "This fortress is mine. My burden ends here." Elena gave a single nod, then turned toward the open corridor. The soldiers parted for her, some with reverence, others with shame, but none moved to stop her. Her footsteps echoed down the stone hall, each one carrying her closer to freedom, each one a drumbeat for the rebellion waiting outside. When she emerged into the night, the city roared. The people surged forward, voices rising in a tide that seemed to shake the very ground. Elena lifted her arms, not in victory but in acknowledgement of them, of their strength, their endurance. She had survived humiliation, she had endured the chains, but it was their belief that had made this moment real. High above, in the fortress that no longer felt like his, General Kessler watched from the battlements. The chance carried to him, fierce and unrelenting, and he knew the world he had built was ending. Yet as he looked at Elena leading the people into the dawn, he realized he could not look away. The end.